Welcome to today's session on psychological health for small business. I'm Chris Bombolas, your MC. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we are speaking to you from today and on which you are learning and working from today. We also pay respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching today. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to watch this important recording. We know, especially for small business owners, attending a live event can be challenging, so we hope this recording allows you and the team to watch at a time that suits you and your colleagues. In this session, we'll be talking about how you can commit to action for a mentally healthy workplace in your small business. In today's session, we are talking about mental health, including psychosocial hazards and risks. If you experience a physical or emotional reaction to any of the content you hear today, please consider employing psychological self-care strategies that you typically find helpful. Connect with a peer or manager, contact your employee assistance service provider or regular treating health professional. Support channels and numbers are on the screen. We know the research tells us that 1 in 5 Australian adults will experience a mental illness in any given year, and almost half of all Australian adults will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. This makes it likely that you, your team, co-owners, clients, or contractors may experience mental ill health at some point. Today we'll hear from Queensland Mental Health Ambassador Hayley as she shares her inspiring story and experiences as a small business owner, and we'll be taking a look at managing the risk of psychosocial hazards at work code of practice that came into effect on the 1st of April. We'll be sharing more about how you can identify and control psychosocial risks in your workplace, the importance of promoting and modelling self-care and balance, recognising the signs if someone in the workplace needs early intervention, and how to support workers when they need it or when injured. John Leigh from Workplace Health and Safety Queensland's Injury and Prevention and Management Program will share insights into Safety Fundamentals Toolkit, a handy tool for small business owners, including sole traders, that can help you understand your legal obligations and comply with the law to create a safer, healthier and more successful business. But first, I'd like to welcome Tanya Orzulak. Tanya is a Principal Advisor in the Psychological Health Unit with over 20 years of experience working for Workplace Health and Safety Queensland in various roles, including as an inspector and investigator. Tanya has a psychology degree and is studying her Master of Counselling and is an accredited Lifeline crisis supporter and mentor. Tanya's passion about the importance of mental health in and outside of work is evident. Tanya's areas of interest and specifically include expertise in suicide prevention, sexual harassment, domestic and family violence, and systematic management of psychosocial hazards and risks at work. Welcome, Tanya.
I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Queensland. So I think I'd like to talk about the integrated approach. So this is what we use when we talk about a mentally healthy workplace. So these 4 parts to the model include promote, prevent, intervene early and support recovery. So we already know that businesses do quite well with the promote and support recovery areas of this model. But what we need to focus on, and what is the purpose of the legislation and the new code of practice, is to actually come in at the prevention stage and look at the intervene early stages. So I'll go through a little bit more about what that looks like. So in the Work Health and Safety Act 2011, a person conducting a business or undertaking has to ensure the health and safety of workers so far as is reasonably practicable. So when we look at this definition, health is both physical and psychological. So when we look at the Act, that steps out what and who has duties. The regulation talks specifically about hazard areas and how to comply. The codes of practice sit underneath this and link in with those duties in the Work Health and Safety Act. And as well as that, there's a lot of guidance information that can support businesses to know what to do and how to comply with specific hazards. So the main reason why we're here today is to actually talk about the new Managing the Risk of Psychosocial Hazards at Work Code of Practice. So this talks about existing obligations that all businesses already have under the Work Health and Safety Act 2011. This is nothing new. This is something that has been around since this Act has come into force. What's new in this code is that it spells out guidance on actually what to do and how to comply. So it was brought about because businesses found it difficult and challenging to know what to do to manage those psychosocial hazards and risks, because traditionally we focused on the physical harm and physical hazards and risks. So it's already in force as of the 1st of April 2023. And as I said, it's actually there as a tool to assist businesses to know what to do to comply with these obligations. So why psychological health and safety? Well, we know that if a person is off work with a psychological health or injury or illness claim, that is going to cost the business a lot in productivity, lost time, and as well the workers' compensation claims and payouts, because workers actually tend to stay out of work for a lot longer due to this type of illness or injury. And when we talk about managing this at work, we're not talking about being all knowledgeable or being a psychologist and being able to diagnose or assist people with their individual illnesses or injuries. It's about looking at the work factors that we have influence over as a duty holder or a small business person. So psychosocial hazards arise from the design or management of work, workplace interactions and behaviours, plant at a workplace, and the work environment. So psychosocial hazards are present as a result of the design and management of work. What happens over time is if these are not managed, that can cause a stress response. And a stress response can accumulate and cause psychological and physical harm. So when we talk about the stress response, we talk about whether it's prolonged, it goes for it's frequent or it's severe. So over time, this can increase that risk of harm. The code outlines common psychosocial hazards that arise from or are related to work. Now, these are just 14 of the ones listed in the code, and these are the common ones. There are more than this that exist. However, these are the ones that we need to pay focus on because these are the ones that are most common. So when we look at high and or low job demands, so high job demands is obviously looking at when work is extremely busy and perhaps we are not being able to have time to have some breaks, or it could be emotional or cognitive demands. When we talk about low job demands, it could be talking about things like monotonous work. Low job control, that's about not being able to have a say in how you do your job or when you do your job. poor support. That can be from colleagues, supervisors, managers or leadership. Low role clarity. We're not sure about what we're supposed to be doing at work. Are we performing duties that are within our position descriptions? Are we being told mixed messages from different supervisors? Poor organisational change management. This is really about when we look at change, we know that that can cause stress to people. So how are we talking about change? Are we communicating prior to, during the change, and after? What sort of communication do we have, and do we have support available? Low reward and recognition. This is not necessarily about pay. This can be simply about saying, good job, you did well. And perhaps also looking at rewarding workers who do a good job, and also making sure that we, if people aren't performing, then we also talk to them about that too. Poor organisational justice. Well, that's about times when we aren't actually consistently applying some of our processes. So what is fair and not fair? And that can be things like whether someone has been performance managed compared to someone else when they've both done the same thing. It can be also about things like promotions. Poor workplace relationships, including interpersonal conflict. Well, this is something we need to kind of get into early on. So we're talking about that early intervention, because where there is some sort of interpersonal conflict, if we don't look at that early, that can lead to more serious things like work-related bullying, violence and aggression, etc. Remote or isolated work. Well, that's about working in a place where perhaps you are away from emergency services or your usual workplace or others within your team. And isolated can be about working alone. Poor environmental conditions. So this is about noisy, dusty, hot, cold environments. Traumatic events. So any workplace at any time, you may experience a traumatic event. So that can be anything from a person suddenly getting ill, or perhaps you see something, or perhaps someone can talk about something, and when you hear that, that can affect you. Violence and aggression. So violence and aggression, the violence is about actually physically assaulting someone. So there is a link in there with the police if this is a crime. Aggression is about the way and the manner in which you speak to someone. So it could be threatening or intimidating, and that leads into bullying. So bullying is more than once. It's about a pattern of behaviour, it's repeated, and that type of behaviour can be offensive, humiliating and intimidating, and it's something that over time can cause harm. Harassment, including sexual harassment. So harassment, including sexual harassment, is different to bullying because that can be just a one-off. It doesn't have to be a pattern or repeated. So what I wanted to talk about here is, I know this seems like a lot of psychosocial hazards, but these are present in most workplaces to some degree or another. What I wanted to highlight is some of those ones on the left-hand side talk about cumulative factors. So it's over time and they interrelate. So let's say we have a high workload, we have minimal control, and we don't have support over the work we do. That can, over time, create that stress response. If, on the other hand, we look at high job demands and we have low job control but we have good support, that can also buffer some of those other psychosocial hazards to minimise that risk of harm. So it's not about actually looking at each of these individually, it's looking at how they interrelate and can buffer each other. Now, just because you have a high job demand does not necessarily mean that you are experiencing work-related stress. It is about relating to those other factors. Also looking at those, we're talking about some of the systems. So it's not about the individual, it's about looking at what the workplace or the duty holder has in place to manage those hazards and the associated risks. Because if we don't have some of that in place, that can lead to some of these event-based hazards like violence and aggression, bullying, harassment, including sexual harassment. However, those event-based ones that I just mentioned can also be a hazard and create risk of harm in themselves. So where do we start? It's the same as what we would do for physical hazards. We look at risk management, the risk management process, identification of hazards, looking at assessing the risk, looking at what we can do to put in place to minimise that risk, and then monitoring and review. In Queensland, in the Code of Practice, we talk about the hierarchy of controls. So basically all that means is you have to look at the highest level of protection against that harm. So it's not simply, well, we need to put a safe work procedure in place and then we need to train. We actually need to go through that risk management process and look at what are some work design things that we can implement to minimise that risk. And really key to understanding risks and hazards at work is talking to your workers. Consultation, I can't stress that enough, is really vital if you really want to understand what's going on in your workplace. So a little bit more about the risk management process. Duty holders, so that's a sole trader or a small business owner or someone in charge of a large organisation, you must follow the risk management approach. Good risk management is important so that hazards and their sources can be identified. And as I said, controls must be aimed at eliminating psychosocial hazards or where there is not reasonably practicable, minimising psychosocial hazards in order to be the most effective and sustainable. So see in that diagram there, management commitment is the key. So that's where we start. Because if we don't have that, then it's really difficult to go through this process. The leaders must be on board with making sure that we are doing all we can. So and you can see around the side, it's consultation. So that is ongoing, it's not once. And risk management, it's about identifying hazards, looking at what sort of risks there are, looking at the controls that are in place, and then reviewing the measures that have been implemented. So when we talk about the Code of Practice, this actually tells you what the hazards are, what the risks are, and also includes some of those controls that you can implement to help you with how to manage psychosocial hazards and risks. Why consultation is key? It improves decision making about work health and safety matters. It allows workers to identify tasks or aspects of their work that cause or expose them to psychosocial hazards. It provides the opportunity for workers to provide practical suggestions or potential solutions to address those hazards. Now I'm going to hand over to John Leigh to talk to you more about the systems focus.
Following on from Tanya's discussion, there's models out there within the Code of Practice. The wheel that we've been looking at is fundamental to every single code, no matter the physical or the psychological hazard that we're dealing with. It's all about the same approach. It starts off with identifying hazards, doing the risk assessment, then putting controls into place and reviewing and continue to see how your action's working. But without consultation and the management commitment, everything falls apart. It's the hub that drives it. It's the binding agent, the consultation that pulls it all together and keeps it working through. But I'd maybe give some more introduction on who I am and how we can provide some support and help and assistance with businesses throughout Queensland. So my name, John Leigh. I manage a team of 20 plus advisors based throughout Queensland, from up in Cairns down to the Tweed and out to Toowoomba and all through the west as well. We also have online resources that are accessible for everybody, so employers can self-assess and jump on and look for advice as a first step to see what sort of help might be available to them, and some easy steps and recommendations that they might be able to put in place themselves. This is all provided through Queensland Government, and it's completely free of charge to any employer who might be interested in seeking further assistance. But the tools there are really to help that next phase of that we have a code, which is sort of in abstract. It's talking about the risks and the controls that must be put in place to see, well, what do I actually do in my business and how do I make this work for me? So we have a safety fundamentals toolkit. I say employers can jump on at any time and work their way through that. There's elements that are in there which go towards making a good safety management system. So it's based on an international approach. The ISO 45001 is the underpinning framework that goes towards this model that we have in there. And as you can see, it starts with your commitment. Clicking on each module will take you into 3 questions or 4 questions in some instances. These are all on this version, on the online version, are quite generalist. It just talks about WHS. How do I demonstrate my commitment to WHS? You just need to then overlay what the particular hazard is that you're looking at. So in this instance, we're talking around psychosocial, WHS, and just go through and ask yourself those questions. Do I do this sometimes, always, or do it never within my business? There's then links and supporting resources and materials that you can click on and will take you through to further understand what it is that you could do better and ways that you can demonstrate your commitment. It's followed through by consultation, through managing risks, how we do reporting, how you build capability within your workforce, and how you provide a safe work environment. Again, it's simple sort of traffic light system where you just go through and do your self-assessments of yes, sometimes, or never that I'm doing these activities. It's then followed by the workers' compensation and recovery at work. So what am I doing if an injury has occurred? What then falls into place to try and get or provide assistance to help my injured workers getting back to the best that they can be as soon as possible. So working with the worker, but also working with WorkCover Queensland to try and get a speedy recovery and get everybody back. These, as I say, self-assessment. If you wish, once you've gone through the self-assessment, some further help and assistance, by all means you can get in touch with my team and we can have a discussion with you, either do some stuff, work with you through Teams or through Zoom, or maybe call out as well and do one-on-one site-based where we can actually learn a little bit more and give you some real guided advice around specifically what needs to be done with your workplace. Moving on to the next slide, your commitment. I think it's been really emphasised strongly today that it really is important for business owners to be able to sort of put their hand on their heart or put their hand up and say, I know what the dangers are, what the risks are, or the hazard within my business, and that I'm aware of them, that I've got an approach towards dealing with them. And once I know what they are, I can then start to look at, well, what level of a hazard is it for me? What does it present to my workers? And then what steps should I be putting in place? But your commitment really is the thing that underpins it. If the owner, you're interested and you're showing and demonstrating to your workforce that this is key to you, it goes a long way towards the next important step of that consultation as well. Getting the buy-in from your workers and getting them to help you come forward with solutions and problem solving. Commitments you should also have made as well. With a code of practice, we're not just talking about things that may harm or damage or hurt your workers here. For small business owners, usually you're in there as well. You're actually involved, you're doing the same task. It's about a tool as well for looking after yourself. It's not just about the obligations you have to your worker, it's everybody within your workforce. So trying to look after yourself, some self-preservation as well to make sure that you're applying those same standards, the same guide to looking after your own health and well-being as you would do for your staff. Say straight from the toolkit, it goes through demonstrating your commitment to talking to your workers, doing observations as you walk through your workplace, maybe pulling up a hazard checklist, maybe something from the code, maybe something you've created yourself. Surveying your workers, that doesn't have to be a formal tick box survey, that can be through things like toolbox talks and getting in touch and getting feedback from your staff around what are the things that could potentially be hurting people here, what are the things that you're being exposed to. Reviewing your data, records and reports, so looking back and seeing, well, what's historically happened in my workplace. Instead of just doing it from memory, have something on paper that you can look back, which ties in with keeping everything in one spot. Some good record keeping will really help you to try and pull these things together so that when you're trying to do that retrospective, you know where to turn. that you can have a look and see what has been happening in the organisation. Bring all that together and keep in a risk register. Yep, many different names: hazard register, risk register, just something somewhere that clearly shows that you're aware of the things that happen within your workplace, whether these be physical or psychological, or maybe ergonomic as well. But these are the things that could hurt the people that are working for me and hurt myself within work in my business. That's your first step. Next one, okay, what are we going to do about reducing that level of hurt that maybe comes through to people? Make our employees part of the solution. Ask them to talk. Your staff generally know the answers. Instead of going away, coming up with things yourself, get them involved right from that very first start of what could hurt you. Next step is, what can we do about trying to reduce that level of hurt for you, and what do we need to do to keep it going? And so it becomes a part of the way that we do things every day, not just as and when the boss tells you to do, but it just becomes part of your working way. It comes around to devising policies, procedures, processes, but they don't have to be the biggest documents in the world. It doesn't have to be, quite often where it's informal and it's moving, that's fine. But what it does need to be is communicated to all of your workforce, get them involved in building the solutions so that everybody knows that this is the way that we do things around here. You can commit it down to paper as you move along, that's fine. But the main thing is try and make sure you've got stuff in place that reduces that chance of harm with your workers. Which is around also building the capability of your workforce. Make sure that they're happy to report and they'll come through to you, that they're confident, that they can speak up and they can be heard, that they can do their job. But if they need training, if it needs processes that are going to help them through it, get them involved in building some of those guidelines and saying this is the way that we do things in there. But the capability as well is around things like taking an active part in those pre-start talks, or your toolbox talks, where people are unafraid to bring things forward to the discussion and get them out. So capability can have many different levels of it, but one is to actively be involved in that consultation process and coming up with solutions as well. Yep, it'll help to reduce the risk of injuries. It'll provide your workers with new skills and knowledge. It shows that you have got an investment in your workers and it values their development. Hopefully, inevitably, it should increase your efficiency and the productivity of your business so that it can demonstrate the steps that you're taking towards managing the risks that are there, but also to legal requirements. And yeah, you need to invest in your people to help them to be as safe as they possibly can be. As we saw, there are many more tabs within the Safety Fundamentals tool that's taking you through each element. Feel free to jump on the website, have a look, and you can click through those and explore it yourself. It'll take you off into a myriad of different directions with the tools and the resources and just the opportunity to learn more about a particular hazard. If you'd like to hear more and learn more from the Injury Prevention and Management Programme, or IPAM for short, please scan here, jump on, you can register, and we'll give you a phone call back and we'll talk about what it is that we can maybe provide for you in your particular situation. If you need further help and support though, then here's a list of many different services that are out there and freely provided for business owners such as yourself, small business owners. Please make a note of the details that are on there, from Lifeline, Beyond Blue, the Suicide Callback Service, Mental Health Triage, Open Minds, Workers Psychological Support Service, and SANE Australia.
Thanks, John. IPAM certainly doing some great work right across Queensland. Time now to introduce Commonwealth Games gold medalist, small business owner and Queensland Mental Health Ambassador Hayley Lewis. Hayley delivers a personal message on the importance of mental health and well-being and reducing the stigma associated with mental illness. I hope that you've all seen Hayley's film before. If you haven't, you can go online and have a look at that one. She joins us. You're a mum of two, Hayley. Welcome. Why is it so important for you to be a mental health ambassador in Queensland? Let's start with the really hard question.
Well, for so many reasons, I don't know where to begin, really. Look, for me, I guess mental health became extremely important when I lost my sister to suicide back in 2004. Obviously, for our family, that was the first situation that we've ever encountered directly with mental health. So, you know, I guess that was a massive punch in the gut for our family, because even back then in 2004, the stigma around mental health was such a big thing. And I guess as an athlete, I grew up with that, I guess, mantra from my coaches and a lot of other people that you had to be tough. You couldn't show any mental weakness at all. If you showed any weakness at all, you were told to toughen up. So I guess I was brought up in that environment, and then when something like that happens to my family, i.e. my sister, I guess it's that confusion of, well, if we're supposed to be tough, how are we supposed to act when something like this happens? So I guess it was a very confusing time for me, because being tough was what I always had to do, and then all of a sudden I felt myself being completely in a headspace that I couldn't deal with. And I guess as well as that, I was a new small business owner. I started a swim school at Westfield Carindale back in 2002, and it was only 18 months into being a small business owner that this happened to our family. So I'd never been an employee. I'd only really started my business as an employer. So I had no idea what it was like to be an employee. So to have that happen to my sister, who'd never had any history of depression, it was a very sudden situation for us. I guess it made me start to think as a business owner, well, if that can happen to my sister and we didn't recognise any of the warning signs beforehand, could it be happening to my staff at the swim school? So I had always, as you imagine, owning a swim school, safety was my number one priority with customers, with kids, with staff. Obviously, slips and fall were a major thing for me at the swim school that I had to avoid. But I'd never taken into consideration the mental health of my employees. So after the death of my sister, I guess it was something that I really took on board. So I looked into, you know, implementing situations at the swim school to really look after my staff and employees. And I guess it was hard bomber, to be honest, because I had staff ranging from 18 up to 65. So as a 30-year-old, it was very hard for me to relate to the same issues that 18-year-olds were having as opposed to 65-year-olds were having. So I guess as a small business owner, I had to really understand quickly that an 18-year-old is going to have vastly different issues in the workplace that a 65-year-old's going to have. So I guess for me, it was a lot of understanding of the mental health workspace. And obviously then when my swim school was demolished, I started a retail store 13 years ago, which I absolutely love and I'm still doing today. So obviously I don't have the same type of safety concerns that the swim school does, even though I have to be careful still of the safety hazards. But I guess I carried over from there all of the psychosocial hazards that happen in a workplace, and certainly the mental health of my staff is my number one priority, given what I'd been through with my family. And, you know, being a very proud psychology degree person now, I'm very, you know, it was something that that was a goal of mine to achieve when my sister passed away, is to really understand mental health a lot more. So now I'm doing my Masters of Counselling with the hope of potentially one day helping people, not only in my business but outside as well.
You've given us a great synopsis. Tell us how you went through the roller coaster emotions with you and your staff and your family, not just from your sister's passing, but you know, your swim school having to forced closure and a change of business, the ups and downs of, you know, when times are good in a small business and you're enjoying it, and times get tougher and it gets a bit harder. How you and the team went through those roller coaster of emotion? Well,
that is a great question, because obviously when you put it all down like that, you know, I can really reflect on what I went through over that time. And I guess fortunately for me, the team that I had at the swim school, there was myself, a manager, and about 18 staff. So it was quite, I guess, a big small business. And I was very lucky that even though I didn't have, I guess, I had no real understanding of mental health and what the things that I had to have in place as a small business owner. I did not know that back in 2002, that was something that I had to be aware of. But I guess for me, I was lucky that I had the opportunity through swimming to have coaches, and I guess they were the leaders. So if you didn't do what the leader told you, you're in trouble. You're expected to be there at a certain time. So I guess for me, becoming an employer, no one was in trouble. But I guess I already had that background of knowing the proper things that I had to put in place for my staff. They definitely knew their job descriptions. I was very, very big on rewarding my staff and making sure that they felt that I was giving them really good feedback. Sometimes I would have to give hard feedback if I had parents and that complain about the level of competency in the pool. So some situations and talks that I had to have were really hard to have with employees, but I always tried to say, hey, we've had this person say this, but I want to also acknowledge that you are doing this, which I really appreciate and I reward. So I'd always try to make sure as an employer, which I still do today, is comment my staff on things that I've noticed that they are doing that are above and beyond what I expect them to do. So I think really good job specificity, is that a word? Being specific about their job role is super, I probably just made up a word, it's super important. I guess people want to rock up to their job and know exactly what they need to do. They want to know what their expectations are. And I guess that's something that, I've carried over from the swim school now into retail. It was really hard as an employer and a leader because you are supposed to be the one that is there to guide the team, to show that you're strong. But at a time when, I needed, I guess, time away from my business, people really stepped up for me. And, I guess that had a lot to do with the foundation that I had already put in place at the swim school, that the team knew what they had to do if I wasn't there. So, and at the time when I first started the swim school, I had small children. I had a baby when I did have the swim school. So, I already had the process in place when, for the team to be able to step in when I wasn't there. So to have to go through that, I guess as a leader, you just got to have the foundations there, like I said, for the team to know.
Tanya and John touched on this, and it's about self-help. Who helped Hayley Lewis when you had to be a mum, you had to be a wife, you had to be a small business owner? Who helps you, and what systems have you got in place to make sure you're okay?
Well, it is all about self-care, like we've spoken about. You have to look after yourself. Even though you're very responsible for other people in the workplace, you're also responsible for yourself. There's no use you turning up to the workplace in a bad mood or feeling down about yourself, and that can happen, to be honest. You can't rock up to work every day and be in a great mood, but I guess it's all about knowing yourself. And I guess for me, health has always been a really important part of my life, so staying active and fit and trying to be as healthy as I can is a big part of my life. But I guess having that background in swimming as well, I guess I think I'm quite resilient when it comes to situations that I've had to deal with, and I've had to deal with a lot. So I think having to go through a lot of obstacles in my lifetime, being a small business owner, resilience really is something that you need, hard work and resilience.
Can you share some of your strategies that you employ to keep yourself, in the game, to keep that headspace in the right area, and sort of what's worked for you?
Well, I guess goal setting is a big thing. And Tanya would know that's something that when you do your psychology degree and your counselling degree, goal setting is a huge thing, not only in the workplace, but also as an individual. Everyone wants to wake up in the morning and have a goal that they want to achieve, right? So, that was, going back to my years as a swimmer, I didn't wake up randomly in the morning and go to the pool and my coach say, okay, just randomly get in and do 100 laps. There was an actual goal that we were setting out to achieve, and a time that we wanted to achieve, and a position in a race that we had to achieve to get into a team. And literally, my life is not really that much, not much different today, except I don't have to do 10K in the pool today. But,
Gee, you're smiling when you say that, I can see.
But look, it's, my son's a swimmer. He comes home every day and, I get to reminisce about the old days through him. And I see it's no different in 2023 with him as it was in 1993 with me. He's got goals, he's got his times up on the fridge that he wants to achieve. And as a business owner, it's the same for me. I have goals that I want to achieve through my business. And the only way that I can achieve those goals is the productivity that I have with my staff. And if my staff walk through the door every day and they've got a smile on their face and they feel good about who they are when they walk through the door, and I guess the leadership and the acknowledgement that I'm giving them, then I'm doing not only my job as an employer, but I'm also helping these people feel differently about themselves. I only just had a conversation with a staff member in the car. She's got another job part-time where she works as a travel agent, and she sounded stressed and just wound up. And I just said to her, you shouldn't be like this on a Monday morning. Let's take your deep breaths, do a little bit of, just a bit of time for yourself to reflect on why you're feeling stressed. Because it does mean doesn't help me as a business owner that she's stressed. So I guess have to do what I can do as a small business owner to help my staff, even when it's got nothing to do with my workplace. It's my job, I see it as, to look after other people as best I can.
Let's address the elephant in the room and about stigmas. They're associated here. Seeking professional help. Back in the dim, dark days, that was a sign of weakness. Now, I would imagine that Tanya and John would agree that if you are struggling or someone is struggling, that professional help and the networks that you have available to you are very, very important.
Well, I'll get these guys to talk about that, but on a personal level, my son, when he was at uni, he had a part-time job. And that part-time job all of a sudden became more of a full-time job for him, in the hours that he was expected to do during COVID. The pressure that he was put under, he would come home from work and having to do uni as well and be in just a complete state of, he'd be crying. This is a kid that doesn't normally cry. And I'd say, well, why don't you say something to your manager about the amount of hours, the fact that you're not getting any breaks? And he'd say, well, I don't want to, because I don't want to be one of those people that go and complain, or if I go and complain, then I might lose my hours. So these are all things that I guess these guys hear every day. It's that, unfortunately, that stigma is still attached to people feeling like they can't speak up about how they're feeling. And unfortunately, even though things have changed, and you would hope so in the workplace, there's still that element, right, that if you feel like, if you say you're not coping, then, I hear it a lot still, that they'll go to their employer and say, hey, I'm not coping at the moment, and nothing's come back they're not come back from the employer with, hey, let's do something about this and what can we do to work towards a better outcome. Sometimes jobs are taken off them, and, when that happens, they start losing their identity and start feeling like they're lacking confidence. So, yeah, that's my personal view.
And look, you've touched on it with Tanya, and Tanya, if I could get you to jump in here, how important is it to have the networks, to seek professional help? Hayley gave us a very personal example of what happens, and this is particularly for young people who sometimes are taken advantage of in a workforce, in a workplace.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, Hayley, because that is a really key point. So there are a number of people that I guess would be considered more vulnerable and perhaps are more afraid to speak up, and definitely young workers. So that's from the ages of 16 to 24. They sort of fit into that category because they're new and inexperienced, and they're really not sure and maybe not confident. And there's also that risk that perhaps they might lose hours or lose their job, that maybe they won't speak up. But I'm here to tell you, if you're watching and you're a young worker, if you are needing to talk to your manager or supervisor about what's going on at work, it's important that you do. And the employer needs to actually be there and support, consult, listen, and see what can be reasonably able to be done to make some changes at work so that it's not causing you stress. But the other thing is looking at other vulnerable groups. So we know now that there's a lot of work that isn't full-time permanent. So a lot of people are doing more than one job, they're casual, perhaps they're doing contract work, and that too makes people more vulnerable. English is a second language, and etc., migrant workers. So it's really understanding that not everyone will feel safe to be able to say what's going on for them. So in those situations where you don't feel like you can talk to someone, it is important still to reach out. So it is about your network. So if you have a trusted friend or friend group or family member, or if you need to, seek medical assistance, go to your GP, talk to them about what options there may be, or call a helpline like Lifeline or Beyond Blue or somewhere like that, just to talk, because sometimes just talking about things can really help you to kind of process and put things into perspective.
And John, what about from an IPAM perspective, particularly with organisations that, may have younger employees, less experienced employees? Do you have some advice from your particular angle?
Yeah, it's commitment. We're going back to those earlier messages of just management commitment, speaking with your workforce, get an understanding of what is actually happening out in the workplace, on the shop floor, and encouraging people to come to you. As a business owner, you can only fix things if you know about them. So it's getting those people to actually be brave enough to come forward with those conversations. Maybe brave isn't the right word. It should just be, this is the way that we do things here. If you're working for me, this is the culture. I expect you to be open, honest and transparent, and I'll be open and honest with you as well as a business owner. And we can't fix things if we don't know about them. Bring them forward and we'll work through, get some common solutions as to what it is that we need to change around the place. It may be that some jobs we look at it and think, we're just not going to do it. That may be extreme in some instances, but there may be some calls where you've got to make and say, well, we just won't do that aspect of our work anymore. Or there may be others. This going through the hierarchy of controls. Elimination is always the best way. But then we've got to look at other ways as well as to, well, what can we do to reduce the risk? It's not just about training. It doesn't really alter the risk profile. It's about what other things can we do to reduce the risk. And it may be that it's some rostering and not exposing people as long into, but things that really hopefully could be sort of an easy workaround with the business, just through listening, talking it through and saying, what would you like to see happen?
And look, we're not supposed to mention the C word, COVID, but it's been a huge, huge factor in the workplace. And John, I'll start with you. It's changed the dynamic of the workplace, and isolation is one of those elements that we need to discuss.
Yeah, for sure. There's more and more people working remote, although I know that there is a big push now for people to be returning back in to the workplace, and that itself is bringing its own challenges. So it is like going through that flux of post-COVID as to what is the new normal. There was a new normal during COVID, but even post-COVID as well. It's about settling down. But again, that's through discussing with your workers and thinking, what does normal look like for you? Maybe some of those adjustments to doing more remote work may actually be good for the business. It's having those open, honest discussions as to what's reasonable for an employer to expect. You still got to turn up, you still got to do your work, but what are the adjustments that can be made as well to work with people?
Hayley, if I come back to you, in a small business, we'll put your small business hat on. You wear many different hats, in a small business, and at times you've got to have those prickly conversations with staff, and at other times you've got to be empathetic. How do you read the room? That to me is always a difficult one, particularly for people who keep things bottled up and you don't actually know.
Fortunately, I don't have a lot of staff now. I don't have 20 staff like I did at the swim school. I've only got a small staff of 4 people, so I know them very well. So it's very easy to see small changes in people's personalities. So I guess, if you work in a larger environment, it was still important for me to implement new strategies, particularly after my sister passed away, where I did understand it a bit more. I started to have weekly conversations with people where we'd sit down, even if it was for 5 to 10 minutes. And like you said, it's so important what John said about the employees knowing as an employer that you are open to any conversation. If you come across to staff and employees that you are a closed off, book and you don't want to know about their problems and you don't care, you're just here to do your work. And, you know, I mean, what type of environment and leadership are you, you know, expressing to your staff? So I guess for me, I was always very big on wanting to know about what was going on in people's lives anyway. So, you know, but after my sister passed away, like I said, I knew then that I had to implement actual processes to really keep on track on what was going on with my staff. And like you said, I would have men and women aged from 18 up to 65. So as you can imagine, with different genders and ages, some people are more open to talking about their problems than others. And particularly back in those days, even more so, no one wanted to talk about mental health. So it was even more difficult for me to make sure that people knew that they could talk to me if they wanted to. But look, those small chats that I would have each week with people just gave them the opportunity to speak to me about anything that was bothering them. If it was someone else in the workplace that they were having a bit of conflict with, it was a safe place for them to come to, because I guess as a small business owner, you are fearful. I mean, back then I didn't know anything about psychology. Didn't have a degree. I didn't know anything about it. So I guess it was a fearful space for me to know, well, what am I supposed to do as a small business owner that doesn't know anything about mental health? But now with the code and now with this fantastic website that you can go to for small business owners, everything's there for you. There's a fantastic toolkit for small business owners that, like me, don't have a HR department to go to where people can deal with this type of thing. The buck stops with me as a small business owner. So if you are out there and like me, you are a small business owner, you can go onto the WorkSafe website and literally everything's there. It's all unpacked. Yeah, it's pretty easy to follow. So yeah, there's no excuses when it comes to learning about the psychosocial hazards.
And I would add maybe that sometimes about taking a step back and not getting caught up in the very emotional aspect around the psychosocial, but having a look as a business owner, what is the code saying that I need to do, or what is, you know, the regulations? First off, I need to identify what it is. So let's actually name it. Then let's have a look at how frequent it is. So do that risk assessment. What's the level of damage? So it's helping you to take a step back and be a little bit more distant and say, what can I reasonably do with this one? And then talk about what can we do to change the profile. Sometimes you run the risk of getting caught up in things because it's very present, and that's human nature. But yeah, hopefully providing through the toolkit and having somebody else as well to bounce ideas around is saying, all right, now let's take a step back and let's say, what am I actually required to do? Give you a bit of breathing space and maybe cool down a little bit and say, all right, what should we be doing here? What should we put in place? Not just for this instance, but forever that's going on that's sort of sustainable within the business, and that becomes the way that we do things.
And since the announcement of the code, we've received a lot of questions at Workplace Health and Safety, specifically from small business during our earlier live stream about the code and the significance of it and the impact of it. And you can watch that earlier one at worksafe.qld.gov.au, and you can get all the resources you need from there. And so we thought we'd answer some of those questions here today with you guys helping us out. And one of the first ones that we'd like to touch on is an obvious question. It's, I'm a small business owner, this is all new to me, so all of a sudden this has been cast upon them. Where should I start? A bit of advice.
I might take that one if that's all right. So I guess John's already spoken about the program that they offer. So that is one way to help you to set up some safety management systems with tools and resources. But as well as that, if you're looking specifically at the psychological health and safety aspect, we actually do have a guide that is psychological health and safety for small business. So it really looks at what you can do and provides you with that guidance as a small business owner. And as well as that, we have a mentally healthy workplaces toolkit that's also available on our website that has a lot of information and interactive links, and it includes a template of a psychosocial risk assessment that you can use to help you to where to start.
The codes of practice, psychosocial is the newest one, but there's been many that have been around for many years as well, from working at heights to working in a confined space underground. They're all pretty much the similar format through to them. It starts off by saying, well, you need to identify your hazards and work through your risk assessment process. And they are very much a how-to guide. You shouldn't be intimidated by codes of practice. They're actually there to help you. This is how you do the work. Then if you overlay it with the other tools that are available through the WHSQ website, helps you even more get into trying to tackle them hands-on and address it yourself. But just to reiterate, don't be intimidated by codes. They're there to help you. It's a how-to guide that puts it in real practice. It's called Code of Practice because it's practical and it's pragmatic, and it takes you through with many examples and case studies and saying, if this is happening in your business, this is what you should be doing.
Here's another one. Can I request a proactive visit from a WorkSafe inspector to review processes and systems and provide advice before incidents actually occur? So be proactive rather than reactive.
Well, probably not for an inspector to come out and do that. Sometimes we do proactive audits and proactive campaigns where we will come out and do that type of thing. However, just the resourcing and looking at the number of inspectors and the number of workplaces that we have in Queensland, it's probably not something that we could possibly do. However, when we look at the workplace assistance program that John's been talking about, that is actually what they can do to help, is to look at what have you got and what do you need, and then help you with tools and resources to actually start to get things together and be prepared.
That's right. It's a small point and it's on semantic, but there's a difference in roles between inspectors and advisors. Inspectors work as authorised persons under the Act, and they have a different role to play around enforcement towards compliance, whereas my team, it's about building towards compliance and capability, work with employers and trying to identify those gaps in an advisory capacity rather than enforcement.
And with IPAM, if they're doing things right, they get a big tick. If they're not doing things right, you'll advise them to change.
Building on the strengths, looking at what you're doing at the moment, what's working really well for you, and then trying to transfer some of that learnings, that knowledge into these other areas where maybe you can pick up your game a little bit, but just using your existing knowledge and building on what you've already got.
Okay. Now, what would be some of the early warning signs I should be looking out for that something's not right with my employees? Hayley?
Touched on that. So if you're fortunate enough to have a small amount of staff, I guess you would be able to get to know them and know what's their usual, what's their normal behaviour. So you would notice those small changes in behaviour, or perhaps their appearance, or maybe emotions, etc. But if you have a larger group, it is probably harder, but it's about, I guess, putting in the time to sort of have those regular conversations. So it's really anything that someone is doing that's different to what they normally do. So it might be someone that is usually coming to work on time or early, and then they start coming in late. Or perhaps they come in and they're not dressing as well as they once were, or maybe they're emotional, or maybe they're getting angry. It can be a lot of different things. They can be crying, sometimes it's just maybe they're withdrawn. It's really just looking at what are they normally like and what is different. And if there are those differences, then that could be a sign that something's not going well.
I agree. It's, I guess, being an employer, it's all about not putting the blinkers on when you come into work. And that's, even if you're in an environment where there's a small amount of staff or a large amount of staff, like Tanya said, you can still see little changes in people's behaviour, the way they dress, if they're quiet, I guess they're, and that's when their work productivity starts to change. If someone that's normally 10 minutes early for work starts coming in 10 minutes later, you start to have to question, okay, it's not just a once off or twice off situation where you could be dropping the kids late for school. If it becomes a pattern, then I guess you start to have to question what's going on. And that's when you can have these informal chats that don't need to be something that is scary for staff and they feel like they're getting grilled and it's combative. But instead it's just it's a simple, quick chat just to, touch base and make the employee know that they're valued and, is there anything that they need to talk about?
Yeah, the fear there, I would imagine, is they're being judged, or it's going to be on a mark or a cross on a little list, where it is not, where you're just offering to talk to them and find out, yeah, you do care. It's a bit of empathy. A lot of this has been employer focused. As an employee, what can they do to make a change? So clearly it doesn't all rest with the employer.
That's right. So when we talk about duty holders and the Work Health and Safety Act, there's more than just the employer, and a worker also has those health and safety duties. So what a worker can do is look at making sure that the way they work doesn't actually put them or anyone else at risk from to the health and safety. It can be making sure that you follow the reasonable procedures that may be put in place for those health and safety issues. It can be also making sure that you follow a process to maybe talk about a hazard that you've identified or talk about an issue that's come up and let people know about it. So it's about reporting some of the things that you see.
I agree with Tanya totally. And I'm not an employee, I'm an employer, but I guess it would help me, going back on what Tanya just said, you need to be able to speak up if you feel that something is either a safety hazard or a psychological hazard in the workplace. Otherwise, you can have an employer like me who I feel like I'm approachable and willing to listen to anyone regardless of what they have to say to me, but sometimes they might still find it difficult to speak up about something that is concerning them. So I think employees have to know that it's their right as well as an employee to speak up about things that are worrying them and concerning them.
John, there are obligations for employers under the Act. Are there any obligations for employees under the Act?
As Tanya alluded to, if you're given instruction on how to work safely, then you must follow that instruction. If, however, I would say, if that instruction doesn't really work for you, because there's a difference between the job as imagined and the job as actually done, and if there's a variation between those, then you need to be bringing it forward and speaking up and saying, well, here's the process you provided to me, but it's not working for this reason. So it's just active engagement, I think, is the most. Follow the processes as they're provided to you. If they don't, you can, if you wish, stop work if it's going to put you at risk, and then go to your employer and talk about it. That can be done. Consultation can be done in many, many different ways. Every business has its own way of doing it, whether it's just around the coffee room or grab a knee before you start work.
Toolbox talks.
Toolbox talks, yeah. There's many different names for it, but it's basically about two people talking to each other and problem solving and coming up with it.
All right. What would be your key messages to middle managers on this particular topic, and advice on how they would respond to these hazards with an early intervention lens? It's quite broad, I know.
Okay, I might start with this.
Righto.
Looking at that, middle managers, depending on, I guess, what their role is within the organisation. So if they have some say over the way work is managed or allocation of tasks or the work environment, they actually are a duty holder as well, as part of being with the person conducting the business or undertaking. So it's really important that middle managers actually, firstly, support and model those behaviours that they would like to see of their workers. And middle managers are also that connection between the upper level and the workers. So it's also about making sure that they communicate top and then down. And it is about probably having those relationships. You'd probably, as a middle manager, more likely to know the staff more intimately than you would the upper level management. So it is again about having those conversations and looking out for those warning signs.
In that sort of supervisor middle management role, it's one about providing that support for the person, because it's really important. That's what the business is about. It's making sure that any worker who's affected, they know that they're getting immediate support from a supervisor or the middle manager. But it's also about taking that step back as well and thinking, what is it around the system that we have in place here that has allowed this to happen? Trying to distance that again from that personal, individual one instance, that may be a one-off, but looking back at what the system does, and is it foreseeable that this might happen again and again? And if it is, then we need to be feeding that news upstairs as well to make changes to the broader system. If it's likely to be an individual, absolutely provide all the support, but then just reconfirming, I suppose, that this is the process, and if we stay with our way of working, then hopefully we can minimise exposure. We can never remove all exposure to all risk. That'd be an ideal, perfect world, but we can always do what we can to minimise.
What is trauma-informed approach? Tanya, over to you.
Well, it's really simply, it's about being client or person-centred. So when we are interacting with someone, it's about really listening and hearing what they're talking about without judgment and without putting our expectations on that, and just listening to the message, and also being considerate of some of the things that they may talk to you about or disclose. So it's actively listening, but it's also being careful about some of the language that we may use so we don't appear like we are passing judgment on someone.
I agree with Tanya. It's obviously all about empathetic understanding. We've heard a lot about being genuine and warm and caring. We've also, I guess through my degree, Tanya and I have probably learnt a lot about unconditional positive regard. And that has a lot to do with, I guess, stepping out of your own shoes and stepping into the shoes of another person, and knowing that, you know, you might be able to cope with a situation one way, but I might not be able to cope with it another way. So you need to listen to how I'm feeling. I sound like a teacher, don't I?
Yes, miss.
You need to listen to how I'm feeling, and I guess put yourself in my shoes, because you might be, I guess, a little bit more resilient, and I guess maybe a bit tougher than me, but not all people react the same way as each other. So I guess it's all about listening to someone, actively listening to someone, using humility and sensitivity, and just being able to know that, I guess, the warmth and care that you provide someone else goes a long way. So it's all about, I guess, like I said, stepping out of your own shoes and putting yourself in the shoes of another and going on the journey with them, and not so much, I guess, judging someone on how they're reacting to a certain situation, even though it might be different to the way that you would have reacted.
Yeah, definitely. That's exactly it. It's individual focus. So what I might find stressful or difficult may not be what John finds. So it's based on our own experiences and beliefs and values. So it's something about, you just have to be there for that person and not put your judgment on what they're thinking.
And what if I'm an employer and I'm uncomfortable with this, or I don't have the expertise? Where to from here for me? I mean, I've got to handle a very delicate situation, and I'm not comfortable, A, and B, I don't feel I'm equipped for it.
Well, I guess as an employer and as a small business owner that has a retail store open 7 days a week, pretty much 365 days a year, I'm stressed and tired as it is, right? So even though I've done a psychology degree, I'm still not qualified to be able to give someone professional advice. So like all small business owners, I would be, you know, advising them to do what I do, which is obviously give them a lot of empathetic understanding, warmth and care, sit down with them and really put yourself in their shoes. And really, I guess, you know, don't judge how they're feeling based on how you think that they should be feeling. And then I guess the best thing that you can do as an employer without that experience is to say, well, hey, I can only help you so much and put things in place so much to help you, but now it's time for you to potentially think about seeking a professional. What do you think, Tanya?
Yeah, I think that's it. It can be uncomfortable having those conversations, and not all small business owners may be like yourself, Hayley, where they're happy to have those conversations. So it is really recognising what you're comfortable with, and if you do notice or someone talks to you that they're struggling about something, it is just knowing that there are supports available, and maybe just recommending or providing them some guidance. Say, look, I'm probably not the best person to talk to. I hear what you're saying. What can I do to help you in the work context at this point in time? But I think it might be just have a think about, you know, maybe going to your GP, or maybe this, just having a look at what they feel comfortable with, because it can be really difficult to have those conversations. And as a business owner or a manager, it's really not necessarily part of your role to provide that expert advice. It's even if you are a registered psychologist but you're in a different role within a business, it's really looking at, well, that's a separate service or a separate area of expertise to your role. So it's just knowing where to provide that information for people to go.
This question came from our live stream, and it's a complex one. So Tanya, I'm going to put you on notice. What are experts recommending for small business owners regarding how to assess residual risk, given they likely don't have psychosocial risk expertise? For an example, know of or apply the hierarchy of controls for planned interventions, etc.
Okay, thanks for that question. So when we look at the code, so the code does talk about those hierarchy of controls, and they're actually also included in, I guess, the legislation. So that is, again, looking at how can we eliminate the hazard, and then we go down to the next, can we minimise, how can we minimise, and then go through down to safe work procedures and training. So it's really just understanding how to go through that risk management process, and when we look at the controls, firstly considering if we can eliminate it, and if we can't, manage it so far as is reasonably practicable. When we're talking about this, I guess, residual risk, that is talking about once we've implemented controls to minimise the effect of a particular hazard, sometimes there might be that a little bit of risk left over, and that doesn't mean you need to be an expert in psychosocial risk management or an expert in risk management at all. It's really just having a look at, if there is a residual risk after you've implemented control, is there something we can do to minimise that further? And that's really as simple as it is.
Again, in that the risk assessment model, it'll be implement controls and review and monitor. So the residual risk that's left, just keep talking with people about it. How big have we overestimated or underestimated potentially the residual risk? And if it's becoming more frequent or a longer duration with that, whatever it is you're exposed to with the residual risk, then maybe we've got to explore what are other methods that we can do to try and minimise that even further.
Yeah, that's it. So that last step in that risk management process, monitor and review, is really key. So that's the only way you can know whether what you've implemented is actually working. Are people following it? Or is it creating new hazards and risks? So it's really important, if we go through that process, to make sure we do that last one.
Sounds difficult to me. It sounds like it could get a little bogged down at times, so we don't want to stress our small business owners. So it's not that onerous, is it, really?
No, not at all. It's about having those conversations, thinking about the way you do business. What are the likelihood, say for example, you've got a retail shop like Hayley. Some of the psychosocial hazards that may be present in a retail shop, some things, maybe you might get a customer that might be a bit aggressive. There might be some violence risk there. There may be those things about maybe high job demands. So let's have a think about what are the ones applicable to your business of those 14 that are listed in the code. And then in the code, it's got corresponding controls, sample controls to think about, to implement to minimise that risk of harm. So it's really simple. I know it sounds really complicated, but it's really straightforward. And again, John and his team can help you with developing systems. So looking at how do we put this in a written format so that we can refer to it and have everyone consistently following that.
So the legislation would then say you've done everything you could possibly do to minimise it.
Reasonably practicable is the key phrase that we keep
Exactly.
coming through. You've been diligent, you've shown due diligence as an employee, you've consulted with your workers, you've demonstrated your commitment, you put your controls in place. It really is just keep looking and making sure that, all right, that's how we think we're managing it. How does it actually work in the real world? So that's just a review and monitor, and if things come across that you're not aware of, then we can change it, but we just go back and follow our way through the process.
Again, our viewers love prickly questions, and this one's a delicate one again. What about if we have a worker who is demonstrating behaviour that is risky for others? For example, they are causing the hazards or treating others in a way that then causes them harm or stress.
Okay, so again, we come back to a number of things here. When we talk about the duties under the Act and we talk about the code, so the employer has a duty to ensure the health and safety of themselves and others, and workers also have that duty to ensure they're not doing things that are placing themselves at risk or at risk of others. So we're just considering all the people who have a duty here. So if you are a small business owner or a duty holder or an employer, you need to think about what should I be doing to prevent harm to my workers. So if there is one worker who has been demonstrating behaviours that perhaps could be exposing others at work to some harm, psychosocial harm or even physical harm, the employer needs to have some systems in place to prevent or minimise that harm. So that could mean, for example, in this scenario, we have something there that talks about performance management. So what is the system you have for performance management? What is the code of conduct or the expected behaviours that workers have when they are working in your business? So if people are not performing within that, then perhaps it's looking at what can we do to go through that process. So it might be giving warnings, 3 warnings and a written warning or whatever it is, because those behaviours are causing or likely to cause harm to others. So the duty holder or the business owner must do something, and it may mean eventually looking at that person no longer being able to work there. But it's important to make sure we demonstrate that we've followed a process and we have something documented to have evidence of why we've gone through this process. So it's having a process and following it, and that way we can minimise that if a worker is dismissed due to creating harm or exhibiting some of those unwelcome behaviours, then there's less chance of unfair dismissal coming back and getting a claim there, because you've showed that you've got a process, you've followed it.
It's an established principle of reasonable management action done in a reasonable way. And if that's communicated out to everybody as well, and I keep going on about policies, procedures, processes, but communicate that, let everybody know that this is the process when you're working here. If you break that, then these are the policies and the procedures that will follow through, so people are aware of what consequences are, I suppose, of working through. You're providing that support for people if they need to adjust their behaviour and come back. But ultimately, there's management action that needs to be taken, and as long as it's done in a reasonable way and it's reasonable action, then from the code of practice point of view, there should be no issues.
To wrap up today's session, I want a question on notice for each one of you, a 30-second tip, a take-home tip for everyone that's been viewing and is going to take this back to their workplace or to their small business.
Well, I think for me, and I'll always say this, it's about talking to your workers. It's about having those conversations so that you know what hazards are present and talking about ways to manage those risks of harm. And it is really about consultation.
Take a step back. Think, what is the risk here that's happening? Maybe distance yourself a little bit from it and say, what can I do as an employer to try and manage this current risk, but also prevent it happening again in the future?
My tip as an employer would be, if you're not someone that's naturally empathetic or big on talking to people about how they feel and are they okay, then it's just having that ability to actively listen to people and make them feel like they're heard and not judged.
Thanks, guys. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this session helpful in understanding how you can manage psychosocial risks in your workplace. Remember, the code does not create a new work health and safety duty or expand existing duties. Rather, it provides clarity and certainty through practical guidance for duty holders about their existing obligations to ensure risks to psychological health are eliminated or minimised under the WHS Act. Please consider employing psychological self-care strategies that you typically find helpful, Connect with a peer or manager, contact your employee assistance service provider or regular treating health professional if you need some support. Channels and numbers are on your screen. You can learn more about the code and download a range of resources to help support you as a small business build a mentally healthy workplace at worksafe.qld.gov.au. Big thanks to Hayley, Tanya and John for joining us today, and for you for taking the time out to join us in this session. Remember, as always, work safe, home safe, enjoy the rest of your day.